With San Francisco holding their first padded training camp practice today, a lot happened, including Purdy throwing 3 interceptions, a rookie tight end burning a vet, and their first round pick, Ricky Pearsall, finally returning to practice. So in this video, I'm going to go through each position and try to break down the players that really stood out today. Starting off with San Francisco's defensive line. While they had numerous sacks and pressures today, they also received pretty bad news with Drake Jackson set to miss the remainder of training camp. This really opens up the possibility for him to start the season on the physically unable to perform list, making it so he doesn't count towards the 53-man roster and allowing San Francisco to carry one more player. But even if Jackson remains with the team, it does seem like he's lower on the depth chart now, with Robert Beal Jr., the second-year player, really impressing. He's always right next to the plate and now is getting numerous pressures on the quarterbacks. More impressive though today was the play of Javon Hargrave. He absolutely dominated both Nick Zakelj and Aaron Banks. On Purdy's third interception of the day, for instance, Hargrave immediately beat Banks and found himself in the backfield. Purdy tried to fit into a tightly covered Debo, but it was intercepted by Odom. Speaking about George Odom and San Francisco safeties, he had a fantastic day and it was probably his best day of the entire camp, which is a good bounce back after Mustafa absolutely dominating the early stages of this camp. But that's not to say Mustafa was bad today, as I also thought he showed out, especially with his ability to cover sideline to sideline. Staying in San Francisco's secondary, their additions in the cornerback room appear to be paying off. Isaac Yiadom, for instance, today did an excellent job of breaking up a pass that hit Logan Thomas right in his hands, and that let Fred Warner intercept it. Last year for the Saints, Yiadom showed off similar aggression, breaking up 14 passes. And as we've seen throughout this training camp period, he's one of San Francisco's better corners, and I expect him to probably be starting week 1. That might just mean when Lenoir slides into the nickelback position, he comes in at the outside spot. But regardless of how San Francisco decides to put it out there, he has to be one of their top 3 corners. But Lenoir also did a pretty good job today. On one play, for instance, when Brock Purdy was targeting Braden Willis on a corner route, Lenoir went up there and just outpowered him for it. Granted, it might have been in Lenoir's favor as the ball was overthrown by Purdy. Outside of Lenoir, San Francisco's rookie Renardo Green, they selected in the second round out of Florida State, took reps with the first team defense at the nickelback spot. During this opportunity, Renardo Green showed off exactly what San Francisco liked coming out of Florida State. He was aggressive in his run fits, and when he's covering his man, he remains active throughout the route, whether that means pressing him at the line of scrimmage or later on the route when he's challenging them for the ball. Green's best play on the day probably came when Purdy was trying to target Juwan Jennings on the slot on a 50-50 type ball, but Green wasn't having any of it and broke up the pass. It's also notable, despite Green's aggressive playstyle, he hasn't drawn too many penalties throughout this camp. Another impressive rookie has been Tatum Bethune. Every time he's on the field, he seems right around the football. In a similar way throughout this training camp, D. Winters has been right next to every play, which is impressive because he's added a considerable amount of size but hasn't lost any of that crazy speed. The continual leader of this group, though, has to be Fred Warner. Today he had an interception on Purdy with a pass that ricocheted off Logan Thomas's hands when Yiadom was there to break it up. It's pretty crazy seeing Warner's knack for finding the football. It just seems to bounce in his hands routinely. And today, if it would have been a real game situation, he probably would have ran it all the way back for a touchdown. Ultimately today, I would have to say Warner's side of the ball won the battle. But that's not to say there weren't players on the offensive side of the ball that stood out. And while it would be easy just to point out how poor Purdy played, the fact is I think it really started with the offensive line. Today, they were just manhandled, especially in the middle with Banks and Zakelj. As I mentioned on Purdy's third interception, for instance, Banks was immediately beat by Hargrave, leading Purdy to force it into the hands of George Odom. And with Brindle out, Zakelj was arguably worse than Banks. He gave up numerous pressures and probably a couple of sacks. It's pretty hard to tell because the quarterback is often allowed to throw after he's sacked. Regardless of how many sacks were given up today though, San Francisco's offensive line continues to be a glaring weakness for the team, and they need to invest to ensure that they have depth going forward. Trent Williams holding out really shows that Jalen Moore can't start for this team long term. In a similar way, Nick Zakelj shows San Francisco needs to develop a viable center outside of Brindle, and I think the most logical option right now is Drake Nugent. I'm not saying he's going to start this year or even next, but maybe long-term, he could be a feasible option. Regardless of what San Francisco wants to do going forward though, Chris Forster has a lot of work to do if he hopes to get this group ready for week 1. Today's performance was simply not good enough. And that was without San Francisco's best edge rusher on the field in Nick Bosa, so things will only become more challenging. Moving off San Francisco's offensive line group and into their tight end group, this group was pretty impressive today, outside of maybe Logan Thomas. He probably should have reeled in that pass from Purdy rather than having it broken up by Yadam and intercepted by Warner. Outside of Thomas though, this group was definitely impressive today. Braden Willis, for instance, lined up as the starting fullback with use check out. This flexibility, in my opinion, makes Willis really indisposable. The other second-year tight end, Cameron Latu, also finally got in on the action. Today he was finally able to get open and catch a pass from Brandon Allen on a drag route. But even though Latu was finally able to get his first catch of the training camp, he was only outdone by the rookie Mason Pline. Today, Pline was able to pick up around 30 yards on a pass from Dobbs when he caught over Chase Lucas. Pline is one of the more athletic tight ends San Francisco probably has on their roster right now, and he's pretty tall, making him a perfect red zone target. If San Francisco could stash him away on their practice squad for a year or two, I think he could make a perfect tight end 3 or maybe 2. Outside of San Francisco's tight ends, we got major news regarding their wide receivers today. Ricky Pearsall, for instance, returned to practice after suffering a hamstring injury today. He participated in individual drills and is set to participate in team activities tomorrow. Jacob Cowan, meanwhile, San Francisco's other rookie selected out of Arizona, is set to return in about a week. Trent Taylor, in both of their absences, has continued to make plays for San Francisco. Today, for instance, Purdy hit him quickly on the slant for a touchdown, and then Dobbs came right back for him for another. Taylor also continues to look like one of San Francisco's more confident and comfortable return men, so don't be surprised if he actually makes a push for this team, even though he's not highly talked about. Taylor wasn't the only one making plays in this group though. Ronnie Bell also scored a touchdown after catching the screen from Purdy. He's one of San Francisco's more explosive offensive weapons with the ball in his hands, and he's just so hard to bring down. In a similar way to Taylor, Bell also offers the versatility as a return man. Another receiver that stood out was Juwan Jennings. He had a beautiful touchdown grab from Joshua Dobbs in tight coverage today. Moving off San Francisco's wide receivers and into their running backs now, Jordan Mason looks like he's establishing himself as the true number 2 back. He took the first carry today, and when he does have the ball in his hands, he's just so decisive with it. He shows off great awareness and then explodes through the line of scrimmage. And he's also shown off excellent hands throughout this entire offseason, much better than Mitchell's in my opinion. But Elijah Mitchell wasn't terrible today. In fact, he showed off great explosion, and more importantly, he finally looks healthy for San Francisco, so hopefully he's able to keep that up. But now, we have to talk about San Francisco's quarterbacks and Brock Purdy's 3 interception performance today. It wasn't just these interceptions though, as Purdy had the completion percentage of under 50% on the day. But anyone who said he's terrible isn't giving you the full story. Purdy's first interception, for instance, wasn't a terrible ball as it hit Logan Thomas right in the hands. But Yadam did break it up, leading to that Warner interception. On his second interception, Purdy was targeting Braden Willis on a corner route. And while Purdy probably overthrew it a little bit, Willis could have done a better job of battling it out with Lenore. Purdy's third interception was probably his most egregious, as Hargrave beat Banks almost immediately, and Purdy probably should have just held on to this, taken the sack. But rather, he forced it into Deebo Samuel, resulting in George Odom picking him off. All of these interceptions though need the context of how Purdy views practice, and that's as an opportunity to improve. He even said that he'll often try things in training camp and practices that he would never try in a game. And I bet that chuck up to Deebo Samuel with Hargrave in his face was probably one of those opportunities. This isn't to write off Purdy's mistakes, but more so give context. Last year he threw a boatload of interceptions and still was an MVP level candidate. Outside of Purdy's poor performance today, Joshua Dobbs continues to look solid for San Francisco for the second consecutive practice. Today, for instance, he was 5 of 8 with 2 touchdown passes to boot, 1 to Trent Taylor and 1 to Juwan Jennings. If Joshua Dobbs can continue to show that he has the consistency to play at this level, San Francisco might actually have a pretty solid backup quarterback. Ultimately though, these are just my thoughts about San Francisco's first padded training camp practice, and I want to hear your thoughts down below. It would also mean a ton if you could like and subscribe, and as always, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.